Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. Given that this is an Indian panel, we're going to try and spice things up a little bit. But before we go there, I'd love for Dinesh and John to briefly introduce themselves and their firms.
So I'm Dinesh. I'm with Accel Partners. We've been investing globally for I think now 30 odd years. We have funds that focus on different geographies: the U.S., Europe, and India. The India fund is sort of the youngest in the family, and that's the fund that I am part of. I am actually based here in Silicon Valley, and I focus on the part of the portfolio from our India fund that has global aspirations.
Great. Yeah, hi, I'm John Dougery, one of the founders of Inventus. We founded it 10 years ago. We've just raised 3 funds, managing a little over 170 million. And it's all based on the experience we'd had in the 10 years prior to that. My partner and I, Conwal Recchi, had invested in about 90 different startups between here and India, had great success with that, and decided to institutionalize it. So we're early stage investors backing Indian entrepreneurs, both in Silicon Valley and in India, and we've now grown the firm to 6 partners with offices both here and in Bangalore.
So I think given that both firms here have been doing the U.S.-India cross-border thing for many, many years, I really wanted to dig a little bit deeper into how you work and what are the types of companies, at least for the entrepreneurs in the audience, what are the types of companies that you invest in? Maybe talk a little bit about the stage and the split between U.S. And India, and what is that bridge really like? And maybe, John, you can start out, and then we'll go to Dinesh.
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned, we are very early stage focused, which for us is defined by a company that has a product, but maybe not revenue yet, or is it Series A stage for us, and we look at that as a revenue-bearing product or service. We tend to make investments of conviction, so we lead. We go on boards, we syndicate the financings, and our mix is about half and half between companies that begin their journey as Silicon Valley companies with typically service delivery engineering or lots of other functions coming out of India, or the other half being companies altogether on the ground in India, and increasingly many more global product companies coming out of India in that mix. So when we started 10 years ago, you would have typically seen maybe 10% of the companies in that half of our portfolio on the ground in India addressing global markets. It's now nearly half the companies. So we've really seen a big change there. But again, we're very early stage, all technology focused types of investments.
Yes, I think ours is fairly similar, early stage, very, very tech focused. For us, the mix, obviously there's the whole local consumer story for India, and a massive population finally getting connected. Some of you might have heard some of these numbers, but just this year alone, 150 million people actually getting connected to the internet via their sort of mobile phones. So clearly the local domestic consumer story is a big element of what we do. We're also now beginning to see the early days of this trickling into business benefits, right? Where a lot of businesses now realizing that, hey, my entire workforce has actually spent their own money to buy a smart connected device, and now if I can actually take advantage of that in sort of interesting ways. Couple of other things for us. One is what I focus on, which is entrepreneurs from India creating global companies. Clearly we have a big base of software developers. Over recent years, we now are seeing some of the layers of good product thought within sort of that talent pool. A few years ago, it used to feel like companies were going global out of necessity. Now we see a lot more companies from India going global out of ambition. They come with that sort of confidence that they can actually take on a global opportunity. So that's a lot of enterprise SaaS kinds of solutions. The one piece that's perhaps slightly unique for us, even amongst the Accel family, is that we're also investors in healthcare and life sciences. So there are a unique set of opportunities, both domestic and global, where we feel like there's opportunity for Indian companies to get to scale. So those are our primary areas of focus.
It's interesting just to set the context of how old or how young the entire sort of venture capital industry is when you talk about India. It's really gone through 3 different phases. right? So in the, let's say, the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, it was what we call the tourist VC phase, where our brethren up and down Sand Hill Road would go to India every 2, 3, 4 months, make an investment, come back without any meaningful presence in the country. Then it switched to a satellite operation where folks like myself would be established in Bangalore, Delhi, Mumbai as a satellite operation for the mothership up and down 2,000 to 3,000 Sand Hill. And then phase 3, which we're currently in, was, I would describe it as, you know, expletive or get off the pot phase, right? Which is basically you're either all in, right, or you get out. So what you've seen actually is some firms selling their portfolios and then moving away from India, and at the same time others, present company included, basically saying, you know what, we're going to double down. We're going to increase the team. We're going to increase sort of our frequency of visits, et cetera, and the sheer, you know, portfolio. And I think that has borne fruit for homegrown funds, as well as, you know, folks like Sequoia and Accel and perhaps Matrix, who have made effectively an acquisition in country or tied up very strongly with a local autonomous team. So I think just having that context in terms of how venture capital has evolved in India, let's say over the last, you know, 12 years or so, is very, very important. So
I'm going to make a quick point. This panel is set up all wrong. Actually, John and I should be grilling him because he's actually the most seasoned of the lot.
No, well, I'm in the position to be asking questions, so that's what I will do. But I appreciate the comment. What will your respective firms not do? So again, for those in the audience, you'll say, okay, here are the companies that we will be investing and we want to invest in. What do you stay away from? And Dinesh, perhaps with you.
So maybe a couple of areas. You know, one which is more of the companies with global aspirations. We still haven't really delved into global consumer from India. You know, not that it's not possible, but we think it's still very early. It's still, we don't really have enough of that sort of talent pool that has a pulse on you know what might fly globally from a consumer standpoint. Although one could argue nobody anywhere knows what might fly on a consumer stand. I think the other thing is, I mean, if you look at the whole India story, right? Sometimes it's tempting to invest in categories where some of I mean, India today is still fundamentally about people shifting existing dollars, right? You know, if they're spending money on something, it's easier to create businesses that simply ask them to spend it in a different way. Whereas it's tougher to create businesses that require new spend. So it's not that we don't do any of that, but I guess in that segment we tend to be just a lot more cautious. The timing for when some of that kind of spend might really become available is still a concern.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. You know, we have kind of a number of contraindicators that are generally based on us as partners and investors. So, you know, all my partners and myself included come out of operating backgrounds. So, and we've fundamentally found that when we invest outside the areas of technology that we understand, we tend to not to get the kind of returns we're looking for. We're not picking as well. And we're certainly not opportunity limited between here and India in terms of deep technology-based startups. And so that's the first thing, is we want to look at deep technology-based startups. So we don't do biotech where we don't have experience and understanding and network, and we don't do offline businesses that involve real estate, you know, retail businesses, things like that. And so, again, not that those aren't good sectors, but that's just not an area of expertise for us. And so that's kind of a sector-based statement. And I think on top of that, horizontally, we try to filter for capital efficiency, which is kind of an old and tired couple words, both in India and Silicon Valley. I think, you know, the capital intensity definitely comes in the success phase of companies. When you're trying to scale and reach 1 billion people, it's going to take a lot of money to do that. So that's not the type of capital intensity we're trying to avoid. What we're trying to avoid is the capital intensity at the startup phase before you get to the success phase. And so that's how we think about kind of that overlay across the technology piece.
Excellent. I mean, so another precursor that I want to put out there for the audience is, you know, I spent 5 years on the ground in Bangalore between 2007 and 12. And I used to write and talk a lot about Indian entrepreneurs not thinking big enough. They were thinking incremental, not monumental. But I think that has changed drastically over the past few years. So with that as a precursor, really from your respective funds or your respective experiences, you know, what are one or two key things that have changed? It could be for the better or for the worse. It's up to you to decide what you want to highlight. But what has changed? Obviously, a lot has. But what are you seeing that's very different now than it was, you know, 4 or 5 years ago? John, maybe you take a crack.
Sure. Well, I think one of the fundamental things that's changed that everybody was very, you know, skeptical of, say 5, 7 years ago, was product companies coming out of India. Everybody thought of India as a services hub, and you know, that going to provide services to the world, and that's true, and that's been a big success over the last 30 years. But people were quite skeptical, and logically so, because everybody's tried to create the next Silicon Valley from a product standpoint for global markets, let alone for local markets, and failed miserably. You know, North Carolina, you go down the list, it's been very difficult to replicate that. But if you look at the blend of ingredients in Bangalore and India in general, whether it's talent, whether it's that talent coming out of global leaders like Facebook, like Google, that are on the ground in India and giving their employees there as much insight into the markets as they have here. These people are now coming out, spinning out as teams and starting companies to build that next generation product on a world-class basis. And so that's the first thing that's happened. And I think the second thing that's happened is that the global customer is now, you know, this is kind of the world is flat paradigm where they don't care anymore if you have a sales guy here in the US calling on them, taking you out to dinner. They're buying over the phone, they're installing on the cloud, and that has completely flattened the paradigm of going after these markets, going after these customers from India, from China, from anywhere. And so a lot of our companies are doing just that. They're selling over the phone from Bangalore, they're installing on the cloud, they're selling on a weekly or monthly, you know, subscription basis, and they're judged on their performance right out of the gate, and the customer rips them out if it doesn't work. And we have a lot of companies that are quadrupling, quintupling by doing that. And so our belief is that India will be for SaaS, for business software, and all the new types of paradigms on top of that, pervasive automation, AI, whatever you want to call it, what Israel has been for security. And Israel, in its, you know, core, has been a huge innovator in technologies around security, and I think India is going to do the same thing around horizontal business software and vertical software.
For me, briefly, I'd say maybe one thing that symbolizes the biggest change is a few years ago, most entrepreneurship originated from ideas, and today I see a lot more entrepreneurship originating from frustration. And to me, that's just a phenomenal, you know, sort of encouraging signal for us. You know, there are folks that are doing their regular jobs, they run into something frustrating, and they imagine entrepreneurship as being a way out. And I think that's really been the shift from, you know, copycat ideas or you know, folks only from certain elite schools or, you know, having gone back from the US to entrepreneurship now being much more mainstream. So to me, I think that's, you know, just a phenomenal symbol of the big change.
I think one of the things that I you know, prescribe to is success begets success, right? So when I think entrepreneurs see other entrepreneurs succeeding, whatever the definition of that success is, they feel like they can do it too, and I think that's actually added to thinking bigger. Not to mention the democratization of all sorts of capital that John, you mentioned. In terms of thinking big, though, in terms of some of the things that both of you have talked about, you know, from a team perspective, is the DNA there? Is there, whether it's on the product management side or the product design side, are you still, I mean, you can take a look at it from a relative lens and say, okay, things are improving, or you can look at it from the absolute lens and say, we still have a massive gap. Where on that spectrum would you say, you know, you sit?
Yeah. So I'd say, you know, some of these talent pools, you know, we are still in the early days, right? You know, the talent pools are there, but they're still in small numbers. Our companies do have to struggle a bit, you know, whether it's really good, true product managers, really good UX folks. But I think what's happened is, you know, because over the last few years, we now have many of these cutting-edge companies from here that have had teams in India. You now have a set of people there who've worked with the best in class globally. And so that learning has really accelerated. So I think it's still early, and I wouldn't claim it's easy for our companies to build those talents. But now we're running into more and more cases where somebody, I'd be talking about a portfolio company or one of the companies from India. So, I didn't know that was a company from India. I said, yeah, brilliant, right? Well, again, just great sense. And both, it's sort of saying that it's you look like a world-class sort of product. Plus, I think it also helps improve the perception that hey, just because it's from India doesn't mean it has to be a crappier product.
Yeah, Mohanjit,
You have that impact sometimes.
yeah. Well, I'll just project. I guess they turned me off. I think it's a really good question. I think you said it best in framing it. It's not about your relative strength. It's about your absolute strength. And if you want to be best in the class in the world, it's not about whether you've improved a little bit relative to where India was 10 years ago. It's how do you compare to Silicon Valley. And we have found, and that's why we add a lot of value to our India portfolio by being in Silicon Valley. We found that talent recruitment, talent augmentation, whatever you want to call it, is really important. And India is not there yet. It's on a great journey. There's a lot of improving. A lot of people are moving back to India from Silicon Valley that have deep talent in product and marketing and go-to-market strategies that are state of the art. But there's too few of them. And for example, we had a very successful company, Redbus, that was a leader in bus ticketing in India. Doubling every year, on a consistent basis, sometimes tripling. But they were really struggling to keep up on the product. And so we recruited a top product guy out of Google in Mountain View and convinced him to move back to join the team as one of the 5 top senior executives in Bangalore. And ultimately he did that, and a year later he was one of the 4 people that the acquirer identified as key to whether or not they'd acquire the company. So these are the real stories that are happening, and I think that's why you see Accel recognizing they need Dinesh here, and there's a lot of value add across border that comes into play, and we're seeing that time and time again.
The other thing, being an aero-astro guy myself, I'm going to weave in, is many may or may not know there's a lunar lander mission that is being sponsored by Google and others called the Lunar X Prize, which is sort of a million or multi-million-dollar award to be given to a team that can put a lander on the moon and have it traverse the rocky sort of formations autonomously. And there were dozens of entries, and the top 3 finalists were a team from Japan, a team from the US, and a scrappy team from Bangalore, India. And it's 30-somethings working hand in hand with retired scientists from ISRO, which is the NASA equivalent, the Indian Space. So, can you hear me? Now they cut me off too. You can't do that. Not to a turban guy. That ain't gonna fly. It should be green, I'm guessing. Oh, the battery's done. The battery's done. So I will project. So shifting a little bit to one of the things that India has been knocked around for lack of a better phrase, is that a lot of capital has actually gone into the country, but there haven't been any meaningful exits, and a lot of times India falls into this trap of being compared to China. Right? Look at China. Look at the unicorns, the decacorns, and the other corns that have been created. And why hasn't that happened in India? Right? And can you hear me? Yes, this is better. I can protect my vocal cords. So so there's been this pessimism on the part of investors, especially on the part of limited partners who are investors in other funds, saying, a lot of money has gone into India, but not much has actually come out. And so one of the data points that we at Iron Pillar have sort of compiled is really over the last, let's say, 2.5 years. So just looking at the last 2.5 years or so, there is somewhere around $11.5 billion of cash that has been returned to investors. Not all venture capitalists, there are some strategics and others, but that is a meaningful amount of capital that's been returned, which usually is seen as a shocking, a pleasantly shocking statistic by many. But it is happening. And so I think it's important to take note that whatever pessimism or skepticism there might have been, I think the tide is starting to turn or change. And I'm going to turn to my panelists. Perhaps they can dig into their respective portfolios and maybe give one or two examples of interesting things that have happened within their portfolio, whether it's from a scale or from an exit standpoint. Maybe Dinesh.
Yes, so I think even 3 years ago, a lot of the returns that we had within our portfolio, a lot of the exits were primarily either secondaries to later stage investors in some of the companies like Flipkart that were scaling, or M&A acquisitions that were predominantly within these early stage tech companies with hardly any equity being exchanged. Whereas now, if we just look at the last 2.5 years, we've seen a shift in our portfolio in the last few months. One company acquired by Target, one company acquired by Stripe. People getting a bit more comfortable with the fact that just because it's a company that structurally has a presence in a different part of the world, it's not as daunting as they might have perceived it to be a few years earlier. And there are a lot of things that within the ecosystem we're also doing to try and promote that visibility. Local M&A, early days, but again we're now seeing the willingness of companies to actually pay some cash, some equity, actually attach value to that, as opposed to just sort of stick to shopping at the bottom, right? And really simply doing only acqui-hires. We've already seen that beginning to happen. There's now a way for companies to list in India that's only open to institutional investors, but it reduces the sort of the barriers that companies otherwise had to meet. This year next year we'll start seeing some of the first companies testing that out. We obviously need some institutional depth there, but in the last couple of years, again, just in terms of signs, seem to have had much more activity than perhaps the previous 7, 8. So again, it's early, but there's a reason to believe that there are lots of things that are happening.
Yeah.
Examples from Inventus, perhaps?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, liquidity is obviously on the top of mind for everybody. You've heard it in prior panels. And, India is no different in some ways than Silicon Valley. There is a, kind of a constipation, if you will. There's been a stretching out of the private lives in most companies. I think India in general, though, is a lot younger as a portfolio. If you looked at the entire startup ecosystem, half as old as, say, China or Silicon Valley, because it's just developing. So, the average unicorn, for instance, we did some research on this. The average unicorn now is over 8 years old in the United States. And if you look at the histogram, many of the unicorns are over 10 years old. And they're still private, right, because that's why they're unicorns. And some of that's true in India. But, regardless of that, we've had, nice liquidity from our perspective. We've had 7 good, investment outcomes in our portfolio over the last 5 years. One that returned nearly half the fund, the others, significant portions of the fund. And they've been strategic M&A by global acquirers. And these are Indian companies, they're global product companies out of India, and some that are here in Silicon Valley as a mix. But, we've got 2 companies that are, about to go into registration for IPO. We think they're going to be category-defining companies. So I think there needs to be a level of patience and a level of perspective. That number one, it is a younger portfolio for all the venture portfolios. It's really only really taken off in the last 6, 7 years. And so the average age of our companies, we've got over 40 companies. The average age is less than 4 years old. Wait another 4 years, and I think we'll be talking about a very different situation from a liquidity and an exit standpoint.
I mean, if you look at whether they're demographic data between the young age, just the average or the median age being 23 or thereabouts, I think this is a young, aspirational demographic, and with the technology trends in terms of reduction in terms of smartphones, and now, of course, you know, officially India is the second largest internet market in the world, and I think it's the second largest mobile handset market in the world. And so I think all of that is going to start paying dividends. And then you look at some of the financial data around average, you know, sort of GDP per capita and things of that nature, where the blended spending ability, coupled with the savings rate, et cetera, I think bodes extremely well for the Indian populace. I'll give you another example of how much headroom there is. I happen to sit on the board of a fairly large online travel company called ClearTrip, and the data that I heard from them recently was that the entire fleet of aircraft in India is less than what Southwest has, right? So just let that sink in, and you've got a large population, and again, more and more people are flying, and you've got, you know, airfares that are in many cases sub $50 one way or sub $30 one way, and so more and more people can afford to fly, and so that entire infrastructure is being redone. So no matter where you look, there is growth. But turning that on its head a little bit, I'm going to turn back to the panelists. You know, we being Indians, are the most price-sensitive species on the planet. The Chinese may argue with us, but I think we've written the book on it. And so when you think about that, when you think about, let's say, India as a market for some of your companies, I know both of you have remarkable companies in your portfolios that have bucked that trend. You know, again, talk about how have they done it? How have they actually turned companies into large, you know, players in their respective markets in a market that is so price sensitive? Dinesh, you start.
Yeah, so I alluded to this earlier, right? We think really shifting existing spend, you know, ends up being the much more sort of fruitful way. Very quick anecdote. Procurement software, typical large company here, you know, it ends up being an investment in the millions. And there's an entrepreneur who started a company in India saying, oh, you know, Indian companies never pay $1 million. You know, these, you know, Aribas of the world, they don't know how to tackle this market. I'm going to build procurement software for $50,000. And they did. And nobody paid $50,000 for it either. But this is where it's sort of resourcefulness. So now what they do is they actually give away the procurement software practically for free. But they're looking at what people are buying, and for certain categories of products, they're now sourcing them directly. And the next time there's a procurement happening, a little thing pops up saying, would you like some free samples of this, which are only priced at blah, right, at a discount to what you were paying. And, you know, everybody says, sure, free samples, why not? You know, samples show up, say, oh, okay, I mean, these are pretty decent. No, I'll order some. So, you know, you almost have to insert yourself in very sort of resourceful ways. And if it's shifting spend and showing that value, it becomes an easier sort of proposition.
Fantastic.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dinesh. You know, I think the other thing we've seen is that, you know, Indians are definitely cheap. I think I'm cheap, or a lot of people are cheap, but I think they're also very value conscious. So what we've seen it be successful is when we're pricing and we get paid, our companies get paid based on delivering the goods, performance. So performance-based pricing versus, hey, pay me up front and trust me, I'll deliver the value, that doesn't work, right? So then that's typically how business software or most things in the US are sold. Hey, you know, buy this thing, you know, work on it for a year, install it, and then hopefully you'll get an ROI, right? That doesn't work in India. But so for example, Red Bus and bus ticketing, they aggregated 20% payment of every ticket. And why would a bus operator pay them 20% of their revenue, right? Well, because they were filling seats that otherwise weren't getting filled. And so there was an incremental benefit to them, and they were very happy to pay the 20%. And it started lower than that, you know, but we were able to move it up as we proved it out. And we see all our companies in the consumer space succeeding with that model. And in the business space, it's much the same. And one unique thing about India from a business customer perspective is it's very highly fragmented. And so you can do that and have some pricing power because you're not just selling to the GEs of the world. There are none, right? There's very few Hindustan Levers and so forth, and there's just a mass of other small, medium businesses. And so you can have some pricing power once you prove that you're delivering the goods.
And I think just one very quick point, right? I mean, if you look at, especially on the enterprise side, I think here in the US and in the Western world, we've seen the benefits of digitization. There's a whole wave. Then we saw the benefits of cloud and connectivity, and then we've seen the benefits of mobility. In India, these are all getting scrunched together in this sort of 5-7 year period, right? And so the opportunity today is not, it's not a mobility opportunity. It's really for the first time for many of these businesses to actually just get organized. So in some ways, the opportunity is very immense, but just one has to be mindful about how business is done today and how to insert oneself in there.
Well said, and hashtag India Rising. So use that. But please join me. I've come to the end of the panel. Please join me in thanking John and Dinesh. Thank you so much.
Thank you.